The cold at Bagram has a particular smell to it in October, diesel and dust and the thin metal taste of the mountains coming down off the high ground. And that smell was the first thing I noticed when I stepped off the rotator at 0100 hours, before I noticed anything else. I had been traveling for the better part of 11 hours. My boots were the only part of me that still felt like they belonged to the army. Everything else was wrapped in a civilian softshell jacket I had pulled on somewhere over the Atlantic, a plain gray thing with no rank on it, no name, no flag, because the bird had been freezing, and I had learned a long time ago that no one hands out comfort downrange and you take it where you find it. I had not come for comfort. I had come to watch a thing I built do the only thing it was ever supposed to do. The Tactical Operations Center sat low and humming at the edge of the compound, a long structure of plywood and HESCOs and cable runs, light leaking around the blackout curtain at the door. I could hear it before I reached it. The particular sound of a TOC at the top of an operation is unmistakable to anyone who has ever lived inside one. It is radios and cooling fans and the small electric tension of people watching something they cannot stop and cannot fully control. I had spent more nights of my life inside that sound than I had spent in any apartment I had ever rented. I pushed through the curtain and the warmth hit me and the light and the glow of the screens. And for a moment I just stood there and let it wrap around me because there it was, my operation. Up on the common operational picture in blue and green, the assault force already staged, the timeline ticking down the right side of the screen exactly where I had drawn it 3 weeks earlier in a plywood hut 2 buildings away. I had written every line of that order. I had walked that valley 100 times in my head. I knew the secondary breach and the contingency triggers and the page numbers better than I knew my own phone number. I was tired and I was filthy and I was, for about 4 seconds, completely happy. Then a young man in a clean uniform crossed the floor toward me with his chin up and his certainty showing, and the 4 seconds ended. He was a first lieutenant. I could see the single black bar on his chest from across the room, and I could see the way he carried it, which is its own kind of rank. He was maybe 26. He had the look of a man who had found the most important job of his life and intended to defend it from intruders. His name tape said Brunner. He had clearly decided, in the half second it took him to register a tired woman in a gray civilian jacket standing inside his TOC, that I was a problem to be removed. "You're in the wrong place, miss," he said. "Battle staff only." I did not say anything right away. I have learned that the first thing out of my mouth in a moment like that is rarely the thing that helps. And so I have trained myself to hold it. I looked past him at the screen. The timeline read 4 minutes to the objective. The assault force was crossing its last phase line. On the radio, low and clipped under the room noise, a ground commander's voice came up on the net. "Higher, this is ground force. Crossing phase line blue. Mission as written. No changes. Executing. Mission as written." Those 3 words landed in my chest like a hand laid flat. That was my mission. As written meant as I wrote it. The lieutenant followed my eyes to the screen and misread everything about my face. He thought I was a lost civilian gawking at something I did not understand. He stepped closer, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he began to turn me toward the door the way you would steer a confused tourist away from a hotel elevator. "Come on," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "This is a war room, not a tour. Let's get you back outside." I let him turn me. I want to be honest about that, because it is the part people never understand. I had a military identification card in my left breast pocket that would have ended the entire moment in 1 second. I had a rank that was 2 grades above his and a name that was printed on the authorship block of the very order glowing on the screen behind him. I had every right in the world to stop where I stood and let him discover, in front of his entire shift, exactly what he had just done. I did not. I let him walk me because I was 36 years old and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the flight. And somewhere in those 11 hours, I had stopped believing that being right out loud ever actually changed anything. He walked me past the map table, and he was talking the whole time, half to me and half to the room, performing the small theater of a man doing his job well. "We get a few of these at deployment," he said to a sergeant near the table. "People wander in from the flight line, no idea where they are." He looked back at me, almost friendly now that I was leaving. "See? Real soldiers, real work. Specialist, walk her to the gate." A young specialist by the door, name tape Coburn, looked profoundly uncomfortable. He could not have been more than 22. He glanced at the lieutenant, and he glanced at me, and something in his face said that he had noticed what the lieutenant had not, which was that I was not behaving the way lost people behave. But he was a specialist, and he had been given an order by a lieutenant, and so he stepped toward me and said very quietly, "This way, ma'am. I stopped at the blackout curtain. I turned around. The order was still on the screen. Every line of it mine, the timeline ticking, the men I had never met crossing a valley I had memorized for them. "Who do you think wrote it?" I asked him. I did not say it loudly. I did not say it the way you say a thing to win. I said it almost gently, the way you tell someone a fact they are about to need. Lieutenant Brunner blinked. "Wrote what?" But I had already turned, and I stepped out through the curtain into the cold, and I let the door close behind me, and the hum of the TOC dropped to a muffled thing on the far side of the plywood. The flight line stretched out under the floodlights, white and gray and gravel, the mountains a black absence beyond it. My breath fogged. Somewhere inside that building, the truth I had just handed the lieutenant was sitting on his screen, waiting for him to read it. I knew it would come back through that door. It always does eventually. I just stood in the cold and waited for it. I should tell you who I was, because the lieutenant got it so completely wrong, and because the getting it wrong is the whole reason I'm telling you this. My name is Brenna Locke. In October of 2019, I was a major in the United States Army, an operational planner, which is a job most people outside the military have never heard of, and most people inside it take entirely for granted. I did not kick indoors. I did not jump out of airplanes for a living, although I had done both in training and would not recommend either as a hobby. What I did was harder to photograph. I built the thing that the men who kick indoors carry into the dark. I wrote the operations. I drew the timelines and the phase lines and the contingencies. I sat in plywood huts under bad fluorescent light for 3 weeks at a stretch and turned a commander's intent and 1,000 pieces of intelligence into a document that, if I did my job perfectly, would disappear completely into the people executing it. That is the strange grief at the center of my whole career. A plan done well is invisible. You build it so that no one in the valley ever has to think about the person who built it. The better I was, the less anyone saw me. The highest compliment my work could receive was for a young ground commander to read it and never once wonder who wrote it, to simply trust it the way you trust the floor under your feet. I had been doing it for 14 years by that October. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, without the reflexive flinch that women my age are trained to put in front of any sentence that admits competence. I was very good at it. I had a way of seeing the whole board at once, of holding 40 moving parts in my head and feeling the place where one of them would fail before it failed. The men who had carried my plans came home at a rate that I am not allowed to talk about and would not brag about if I were, because the number is made of people, and you do not brag about people. 3 weeks before the night in the TOC, I had been handed this one. The task force needed an operation built against a hard target in a valley that had eaten 2 previous attempts. I built it. I built it with a targeting warrant named Silas Eng, a quiet man with reading glasses and 20 years in, who could find a needle in a haystack and then tell you the needle's life story. We had walked every inch of it. We had wargamed the branches until our eyes bled. I had written a secondary breach into the order, a contingency on page 11, because I had a feeling about the primary approach that I could not fully justify and had learned never to ignore. The feeling was not mystical. People outside the work like to imagine it as instinct, as some gift, and it is not. It is 14 years of pattern compressed into something faster than conscious thought. I had looked at the primary approach for 3 days, and every time my eye crossed the narrow defile that led to the breach point, something in me tightened. On paper, it was the fast route. On paper, it was the obvious choice, and the 2 operations that had failed in that valley before mine had both taken the obvious choice. I could not prove the defile was a trap. I could only feel that a force stacking up in that narrow space would lose the one thing that kept men alive in a breach, which was the ability to move. So I built the secondary. I spent 2 extra days on a contingency that, if everything went right, no one would ever use, and I buried it on page 11, where it would be there the instant someone needed it, and invisible every minute they did not. Silas had watched me do it. He was the only person who had ever really watched me work, all the way down, and he understood what the secondary breach was. It was not a tactic. It was a confession. It was me saying, in the only language the job allowed, that I did not trust the obvious thing, and I would spend my own sweat to build an escape from it, because somewhere in that valley were men whose mothers did not know their names yet would grieve them forever, and I was not willing to let the obvious choice be the last choice they ever got. When the plan was done, I did something I rarely did. I asked to fly forward to watch it execute. Silas had looked at me over his glasses when I told him. We were standing at the plywood table in the planning hut, the order printed and bound, the maps rolled. "You don't have to be there, ma'am," he said. "It's a good plan. It'll run itself." "I know," I said. "That's kind of the point of a good plan." He said it gently. Silas was one of the few people who understood the shape of my job well enough to know that flying forward to watch was, in a sense, an admission. It runs without you. I know, I said again. He did not push. He just nodded slowly and went back to packing the maps, and I stood there feeling the thing I could not say, which was that I had spent 14 years building operations that disappeared into other people, and just once, before this deployment ended, I wanted to stand in the room and watch one land, not to be thanked, not to be seen even, just to be there, just to know, in my own body, and not only on paper, that the thing I had made had been real. That is not a reason you can put on a travel request. So I put down a different reason, something about liaison and continuity, and I got on the bird. There was one person on that deployment I could say the true thing to, and her name was Aisling Frost. She was a major too, a flight surgeon, and we had found each other the way women find each other in places like that, by a kind of gravity. The night before I flew forward, she had sat on the end of my cot in the medical bee hut and listened to me explain why I was going, and she had seen straight through the liaison language to the soft thing underneath. When I called her on the morning after the talk from a phone tent with the sun coming up gray over the mountains and I told her what had happened, she was silent for a long moment. "You let a baby LT throw you out of your own war," she said finally. "Brenna." "I let him, yes. You had your card right there." "I did. Why?" I looked out the flap of the tent at the flight line where I had stood in the cold a few hours before. I thought about how to say it. "Because I was tired of explaining myself to rooms that had already decided what I was," I told her. "I have been correcting that man my whole life. He just keeps changing uniforms." She did not have an answer for that, because there is not one. She just breathed out on the other end of the line, and she said, "Okay, but you know that's not actually a strategy, right? Being too tired to be respected." "It's not a strategy," I agreed. "It's just where I was standing." The thing about the lieutenant's hand on my shoulder is that I had felt it before. Not the literal hand, the other thing. The certainty in a room that I did not belong to the work I had done. The first time, the time that set the shape of everything after, was in 2014. I was a captain then, an assistant plans officer in a brigade headquarters, young and hungry and not yet careful. We had a hard problem, and I solved it. I built an operation that did the thing the brigade had been failing to do for months, and I built it well. And I was proud of it in the open, uncomplicated way you are allowed to be proud of things before you learn better. The man above me in that shop was a major named Wade Beckett. He was charming and tall and good in front of a general, all the things I was not. When the plan was ready, he carried it up the chain. I did not go to the briefing. Captains rarely did. He briefed it, and he was good at briefing. And somewhere in the briefing, the operation stopped being the thing I built and became the thing the plans shop produced, which everyone in the room understood to mean the thing Major Beckett produced. He never said it was his. He was too smart for that. He just let the room assume, and the room assumed. Because the room always assumes in the direction of the tall, charming major and away from the quiet captain who was not even present. The operation succeeded. There was a decoration. It went on his chest. He shook my hand in the hallway afterward, and he was perfectly sincere when he said it. "Great staff work, Locke," he told me. "This is what the team is for." He was not lying exactly. That is the part that took me years to understand. He believed it. He believed that the team had produced it, and that he was the team. And in his version of events, he was not a thief. He was a leader. And the distinction between those two things had simply dissolved somewhere in his career. I stood in that hallway, and I felt something close inside me that has never fully opened since. I went back to my desk that afternoon, and I sat down and I pulled up the next problem. Because there is always a next problem, and I built it too, and I built it well, and I told no one that anything had happened, because nothing had happened that anyone would recognize as a wound. No one had hit me. No one had insulted me. A charming major had carried my work up a staircase, and a room full of good men had assumed the obvious thing, and the obvious thing had not been me. There is no form to file for that. There is no counseling statement. There is only the slow, private rearrangement of a person who has just learned the real rules of the game she is actually playing, which are not the rules she was told. What I learned that day was this. A plan has no fingerprints unless someone decides to look for them. The work does not announce its author. It sits there, perfect and silent, and the credit flows to whoever is standing in the brightest part of the room when the lights come up. So I made a decision, the way you make decisions at 31 without knowing you are making them for the rest of your life. I decided to stop waiting to be recognized. I told myself that the work was the reward, that I did not need the room to say my name, that I would simply be so good that the goodness would be its own monument. I got quieter. I got more careful. I got more excellent. And I got more alone, and I told myself those were the terms of the trade, and I had accepted them. Most days I even believed it. But you do not actually stop wanting to be seen. You just stop expecting it, which is a different and lonelier thing, and you carry the wanting around inside you like a stone you have decided not to mention. And every so often, a man in a clean uniform puts his hand on your shoulder and walks you toward a door, and the stone turns over, and you are 31 again in a hallway watching your own work walk away on someone else's chest. That is what I was standing in the cold remembering, the night at Bagram, when the door of the TOC opened behind me and a different kind of man came out. I heard the gravel before I heard the voice, a heavy, even tread, unhurried. Then it stopped, and there was a silence with weight in it, and then a voice I had not heard in 5 years said my name like it was a fact he had always known. Major Locke! I turned around. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a gray high and tight and a face like weathered stone, and on his chest he wore the rank of a command sergeant major, the highest an enlisted soldier can climb, 3 full stripes and 3 rockers around a star. His name tape said Bonner. I had served with him in 2014 in the brigade, in the same headquarters where Wade Beckett had carried my plan up the stairs. Travis Bonner had been a first sergeant then. He had been in the room for more of it than anyone, and he was the one person who had ever privately told me he knew whose work it was. He crossed the gravel toward me now, and he stopped a few feet away, and he looked at me. And his eyes moved over the civilian jacket and the no rank and the tired, and he was not fooled by any of it for a single second. I'd know that look anywhere, he said. You wrote tonight's package, didn't you, ma'am? Hello, Sergeant Major, I said. Don't hello me. There was something rough in his voice. What are you doing standing out here in the cold? I almost didn't tell him. But Travis Bonner was not a man you lied to about small things, and so I told him plainly the way you report. A lieutenant had taken me for a lost civilian and walked me out, and I had let him, and now I was standing on the flight line watching my own operation through a wall. Bonner was quiet for a long moment. I watched him decide several things. Then he did the thing that the lieutenant could not. The thing that is so simple and so rare that it can take your breath. He read the room by the work instead of the collar. Some people, he said slowly, read a person by the rank on their chest. You walked in here in a gray jacket and a baby officer saw nothing because there was nothing on you to see. And so to him there was nothing there. He shook his head. I served with you for 14 months, ma'am. I watched you build the thing that brought my soldiers home in 14. I do not need a collar to know who you are. I did not trust myself to answer that right away. Come on, he said, and he stepped past me and put his hand on the door, not on my shoulder, on the door, and he held it open. Your commander's looking for his planner, and I would pay a month's pay to be standing there when that lieutenant figures out who he walked to the gate. I should explain about Colonel Ward Holloway, because the lieutenant's certainty was about to meet the one force on that compound it could not survive, and that force was a tired colonel who did not like to run an operation without the person who built it in the room. Holloway commanded the task force. He was 49, lean, with the kind of face that had stopped performing rank a long time ago because it no longer needed to. I had briefed him a dozen times. He had a habit that I had come to love, which was that when an operation got delicate, he did not want the senior officer or the loudest officer at his elbow. He wanted the author. He wanted the person who had actually written the branch the operation was about to need, because that person knew things about the plan that were never written down, the soft reasons under the hard lines. When I came back through the curtain behind Bonner, Holloway was standing at the map table with his back to the door, and he was asking the room a question that had begun to develop an edge. Where is my planner? He said. I flew Locke forward for exactly this. I am not running the objective without her in this room. Somebody find me Major Locke. The talk had gone a particular kind of quiet. Lieutenant Brunner was standing near the screen, and I watched the words land on him. Major Locke, and I watched him not understand them yet. The way you do not understand a thing your body has already begun to understand before your mind catches up. He looked at the order on his screen. I do not know what made him look. Maybe Bonner's hand on the door. Maybe the cold coming in. He looked at the order, the long bound document open on his monitor, and his eyes went to the bottom of the first page, to the small block of text that every operations order carries and that almost no one ever reads. The authorship block. The line that says who built the thing. Sir, Brunner said. His voice had changed. She was just here. Holloway turned around. He saw me. His face did something complicated and warm and relieved all at once. There you are, he said. Why are you wet? It's cold out, sir, I said. Bonner, beside me, said nothing, but I felt him enjoying himself with the particular restraint of a command sergeant major who has waited his whole life for a moment and intends to savor it slowly. Holloway looked from me to the lieutenant and back, and I watched him read the whole thing off our faces in about 2 seconds because that was another thing he was good at. He did not say anything about it yet. There was an operation on the floor, and it was 4 minutes from the objective, and the man was a professional. But something settled in his expression, a note he had made and would return to. Get over here, Major, he said. I need you on this map. If this branches, I want the person who wrote the branch, not somebody reading me the branch off a page. And so I crossed the floor I had been walked off of 10 minutes earlier, past Lieutenant Brunner, who had gone very still, and I took my place at the map table next to the commander, in the wet gray jacket with no rank on it, and I put my hands flat on the table, and I looked at the picture and I went to work. This is the part that is hardest to explain to people who have never done it. The same room that had no place for me 10 minutes earlier suddenly had a chair with my name on it, and I took the chair, and I did not let myself feel anything about that yet, because down in the valley there were men at a breach point, and they did not care in the slightest who had been rude to me in a plywood building. Their lives did not pause so that I could process an insult. That is the discipline of the work. You set yourself down, the whole bruised, wanting self of you, and you pick up the picture, and you become, for as long as it takes, only the part of you that is useful. I read the screen. The assault force was at the primary breach, and I felt it. The thing I had felt 3 weeks earlier in the planning hut, the wrongness in the primary approach that I had never been able to fully justify. The breach was slow. The timeline on the right side of the screen was bleeding. Talk to me, Major, Holloway said quietly beside me. What are you seeing? The primary's hung, I said. The approach is too narrow, they're stacking. I wrote a secondary for exactly this. Behind us, near the screen, a staff officer leaned toward me, a major I did not know well, and he said something in a low voice that was meant to be kind and that I had heard 100 versions of across my career. Ma'am, he said, before this gets going, about Brunner. He's a good kid. Long night, end of a long rotation. Let's keep this inside the family, yeah? No need to make a thing of it. I want you to understand the precise shape of that moment because it is the real heart of this whole story, more than the insult and more than the reveal. The operation was at its most dangerous point. Men were stacked at a breach that was not working. And in that exact moment, a fellow officer leaned in to ask me gently to begin the work of making myself small again, to swallow it, to make sure that the boy who had walked me out would not have to feel the weight of having done it. For unit harmony, for the family, the same words, always the same words, that the Army and every other institution uses when it would like a woman to absorb something so that no one else has to. The old erasure reached for me right there, with my hands on the map. It would have been so easy. It is always so easy. That is the trap of it. You just nod. You just say, of course, no problem, long night, and you fold yourself back down to a size the room is comfortable with, and the room rewards you for it with a warmth that feels almost like belonging, and you tell yourself that is the same as respect. I had been taking that deal my whole life. I did not answer the staff officer. I did not have room for him. I had a breach that was failing and a contingency I had written for this precise minute, and I made my decision in the way I had learned to make the only decisions that ever mattered, which is quietly, with my hands steady, without raising my voice at all. I keyed nothing. I did not need to. I leaned to the radio operator and I gave the call. Tell ground force, shift to the secondary breach. Sequence Charlie. It is already in his order. Page 11. Tell him page 11 and he'll know. The radio operator set it into the net. There was a pause, the small, eternal pause of a transmission going out to men in the dark. And then the ground commander's voice came back, and it was steadier than it had been a moment before. Because a man at a failing breach who is suddenly handed a door he did not know he had will sound exactly like that. Copy, page 11, sequence Charlie, shifting to secondary, executing. I did not raise my voice. I gave the call I had written 3 weeks earlier for exactly this minute, and I let everyone in that room hear who it came from, and that in the end was the only revenge I ever took. Not against the lieutenant, against the years, against every hallway and every room that had let the work walk away on someone else's chest. I had spent a decade and a half being erased politely, one gracious nod at a time, and I was done. I was not going to break a 26-year-old boy to feel even with the past. But I was finished disappearing to keep a room comfortable. On the screen, the assault force peeled off the primary and flowed to the secondary breach, the one I had drawn on a cold morning weeks before because I had a feeling I could not explain. The stacking cleared, the timeline stopped bleeding. The little blue icons moved through the door I had built for them on page 11, and I set the handset back in its cradle, and for the first time all night, I looked directly at Lieutenant Cole Brunner. He was looking at me. He had heard the whole thing, he had heard page 11, and he had read the authorship block, and his certainty was gone from his face entirely. And what was left under it was very young and very stricken. I did not say anything to him. There was nothing to say yet. The breach was clean, but the objective was not secured, and the work was not done, and the work always came first. That was the discipline. That was the whole life. The net came alive again, the ground commander's voice tight and fast, and then, after a moment, loosening. Higher. This is ground force. We are through. On the objective. Stand by. And the room held its breath. All of us. The commander and the command sergeant major and the staff officer who had wanted me to be small, and the lieutenant who had walked me to the gate. All of us holding the same breath over the same valley, waiting to find out whether the thing I had built was going to bring everyone home. It took 11 minutes. They were long minutes. I have lived through enough of them to know that there is no praying like the praying you do over a radio net with your whole body, in total silence, to a God you are not sure you believe in, about men whose faces you have never seen. I stood at the map table, and I did the thing I always did during those minutes, which was to walk the plan one more time in my head. Not because there was anything left to change, but because it was the only way I knew to be with them. I followed them through the secondary breach in my mind. I saw the corner I had worried about, and I saw them clear it. I held the timeline in my body. Beside me, Holloway stood with his arms folded and his eyes on the screen, and he did not say a word. And behind me, I could feel the whole room doing the same silent arithmetic, the math of people who have sent other people into the dark and can do nothing now but count. There is no rank in those minutes. That is the secret of them. The colonel and the command sergeant major and the major in the wet gray jacket and the lieutenant who had walked her out and the specialist who had escorted her, all of us were reduced to the same helpless size, all of us praying the same wordless prayer at the same radio. And for the length of those 11 minutes, the only thing in that room that mattered was a thing none of us could touch. Then the net came up clear and clean. Higher. This is ground force. Objective secure. All elements accounted for. No friendly casualties. I say again, all elements accounted for. Something went out of the room. A tension that had been holding everyone upright, and people breathed, and a few of them put their hands flat on tables or on the backs of chairs. Holloway closed his eyes for a second. Bonner, behind me, let out a long breath through his nose. I did not move. I just looked at the screen and at the little blue icons that were people, all of them accounted for, and I felt the thin, clean thing that is the closest my job ever comes to joy. Then the ground commander's voice came back on the net, and it did the thing that broke me a little, quietly, where no one could see. Higher, be advised. We hung up at the primary. The shift to the secondary breach saved us 20 minutes minimum, and given what we found on the objective, probably a lot more than time. A pause. Whoever wrote this order. The page 11 contingency. Thank them. Personally. That was the whole night right there. The room was very quiet. Holloway did not even pause. He keyed the handset himself, and he looked at me while he did it, and he said into the net, in a voice pitched for the valley and for the room at the same time, Ground force, this is the commander. She's standing right here next to me. Major Brenna Locke. She wrote all of it. I'll pass your thanks. I have been in rooms when something true arrives and rearranges everything. It does not feel the way you imagine. It is not loud. It is a pressure change, a sense of the air in a space reorganizing itself around a fact that can no longer be avoided. That is what happened in the TOC. 40 people who had watched a lieutenant walk a woman in a gray jacket out to the gate now understood, all at once, that the woman was the author of the operation they had just watched succeed. And the understanding moved through the room like weather. Holloway set down the handset. He looked at Lieutenant Brunner, and he was not cruel. I want to be clear about that. He was never cruel, but he was exact. and exactness in a commander can be a heavier thing than cruelty. "Lieutenant," he said, "the order on your screen, the one we just executed. Read the authorship block out loud. For the room." Bruner's throat moved. He looked at the screen. He found the small line of text at the bottom of the first page that he had walked past all night, the line that almost no one ever reads. "Plans, officer," he said, and his voice was very low. "Major B. Locke." "Louder, Lieutenant, the folks in the back." "Major B. Locke," Bruner said again. "Sir." And then there was a silence, and in the silence the whole shift turned, one by one, the way a field of grass turns when the wind crosses it, and they looked at me. The woman they had watched get walked out the door, and the door, this time, stayed open, and I stood at the map table in my wet gray jacket, and I let them look, and I did not make myself small, and I did not make him small either. I just stood there and let the truth fill the room it had always belonged in. The aftermath of a thing like that does not arrive all at once. It moves through the people slowly, finding each of them where they are. Holloway handled the command piece, the way good commanders handle it, which is to say without a public execution. He did not destroy Lieutenant Brunner on the floor. That is not what authority is for, and Holloway knew it. There would be a counseling. There would be a quiet, serious conversation between a colonel and a young officer about judgment, about the difference between guarding a room and deciding who is allowed to be a person inside it. But it would happen the right way. In private, sized to the lesson and not to the spectacle. I learned later that Holloway's first words to Bruner, behind a closed door, were not about me at all. They were a question. He asked the lieutenant how many people he had decided did not belong in a room that week by looking at them, and whether he had been right about all of them, or only about the ones who never came back to find out. Bruner found me himself, a few hours later, near the chow tent, in the gray of the very early morning. I was sitting alone with a paper cup of coffee, watching the sky go from black to the color of dishwater over the mountains, and he came and stood a respectful distance off and waited until I looked at him. "Ma'am," he said, "I didn't know who you were." There it was, the whole thing, in one sentence, said as an apology and built like an excuse, and I understood it completely, because it was the sentence the entire world had been saying to me my whole career. I looked at him for a moment. He was so young. He had the miserable, scraped look of a person who has just discovered something about himself that he is going to have to carry. And I recognized it because I had carried versions of it too. There is a kind of correction you can give a young person that has contempt in it, that is really just you handing your old wound to someone smaller so you do not have to hold it anymore. I had been handed enough of those to know I did not want to pass one on. "I know you didn't know who I was," I said. "That is exactly the part to fix, not the knowing, the deciding." I let that sit. "You looked at me, and you decided there was nothing there because there was nothing on me to see. You don't get to do that, Lieutenant. You don't get to decide who belongs in a room by looking at them. The day you can do that perfectly is the day you can throw people out. That day is not coming, so you're going to have to learn to ask instead." He took it. To his credit, he took all of it, standing there in the cold, and he did not reach for another excuse. He just nodded, and his jaw was tight, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And then, after a second, quieter, "I'm sorry. Not for not knowing. For the hand. I put my hand on you. I shouldn't have done that to anyone." That was better. That was the apology underneath the apology, and it was real, and I told him so, and I told him to go get some sleep, and I watched him walk off into the gray with the particular heaviness of a young man who has just gotten a year older in one night. I did not hate him. I never had. He was not Wade Beckett. He was a boy who had made a small, ugly choice out of a small, ugly certainty. And unlike Beckett, he had turned around and faced it. There's a whole world of difference between those two things, and I had lived long enough to know it mattered. Specialist Coburn found me, too, while I was still sitting there, the young soldier who had been told to walk me to the gate. He had a tray in his hands, and he stopped at my table, and he looked even more wretched than the lieutenant had. "Ma'am," he said, "I should have said something. In there, I knew you weren't, I could tell you weren't lost. And I didn't say anything. I just did what I was told." He swallowed. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything." I waved him into the seat across from me, and he sat, balancing his tray, 22 years old and miserable about it. "You were a specialist who got an order from a lieutenant," I said. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you should have refused it. That's not as simple as people make it sound, and you know that better than I do right now." I drank some of the terrible coffee. "But I'll tell you the thing I wish someone had told me at your age. You noticed. That's the whole game, Coburn. Most people in that room didn't notice anything. You noticed. And it sat wrong with you, and it's still sitting wrong with you this morning. Don't lose that. The day noticing stops bothering you is the day you've become part of the problem. Keep it. It's the most useful thing you've got. He looked at me like I had handed him something he did not expect, and maybe I had. He ate his breakfast across from me, and we did not talk much more, but he sat there the whole time, and I understood that for him, sitting there was the apology, and I let him make it. Captain Diego Salas came off the Bird later that morning. He was the ground commander, the voice on the net, the man at the failing breach who had been handed page 11. He came looking for me specifically, still in his kit, still with the dust of the valley on him, his eyes hollow, the way men's eyes are hollow when they have just been very close to something. He found me at the planning hut, where I had gone to start the after-action, and he stopped in the doorway, and he looked at me for a moment as if confirming I was real. "Major Locke," he said. "Captain Salas." "Page 11, ma'am." He came in and he put out his hand, and I took it, and he held on a beat longer than a handshake. I have read a lot of operations orders. I have never in my life been so glad to read a page 11. You wrote a door into that thing that I didn't know was there until I needed it, and it was there. His voice was rough. "All accounted for. You should know that. Whatever happened in here last night, and I heard about it, all accounted for. That's yours. I have received a few honors in my career. None of them ever weighed what that handshake weighed. A medal is given to you by an institution. That was given to me by a man who had been in the valley, who had needed the thing I built and found it holding under his hand, and there is no decoration on earth that outranks that. Bonner brought me coffee at dawn and said nothing at all about any of it, which was its own kind of eloquence. He just set the cup down next to me at the planning table, bad coffee in a paper cup, and he put one heavy hand on my shoulder for exactly 1 second, the same shoulder the lieutenant had grabbed, except that this was the opposite of that. This was a hand that knew exactly who I was and had always known, and then he took his own coffee and went off to do the 10,000 things a command sergeant major does at the start of a day. He never mentioned the night again. He did not need to. We had served together. He had read the room by the work 14 months running. There was nothing to say that the coffee did not already say. I should tell you the truth about how it felt, because I think if I only told you the good parts, I would be lying to you. And the whole point of telling you any of this is that I am tired of the lie. It did not feel like victory. I sat on a stack of pallets on the flight line at 5 a.m. after the after-action was started and the coffee was gone, and I watched the sun come up red over the high ground. And I waited to feel triumphant, and the feeling did not come. What came instead was thin and cold and clean, like the air, and a little bit like grief. Because here is the thing that the reveal did not fix. It corrected one night. It did not give back 2014. The decoration was still on Wade Beckett's chest, in a shadow box, in a house somewhere, and the men it was given for had never known whose plan brought them through, and they never would. The reveal did not give back the 14 years of operations that had disappeared so completely into the people executing them that even the people executing them never wondered. It did not give back the version of me that had walked into that hallway at 31, still believing the room would be fair if I was only good enough. It did not give back the long, particular loneliness of being excellent and unseen, of building the floor that everyone else stood on and being asked, gently, to keep standing in the basement. Being right is a cold thing to hold at 5 a.m. I had wanted it for so long, the moment when the room would turn and see me, and I had it now, finally, and it weighed about as much as the paper cup in my hand. That is the part no one warns you about. The recognition you spend your life starving for, when it finally comes, does not fill the years you spent hungry. It just tells you the years were real. I thought about the men in the valley who would go home and never know my name, and I found, sitting there, that I did not need them to. That was the strange gift hidden inside the cold. The recognition I had wanted my whole life was the recognition of the room, the loud public turning of 40 faces, and I had it now, and it weighed nothing. But the other thing, the real thing, the men coming home, had never needed my name attached to it at all. It had been complete the moment the net said all accounted for. I had spent years confusing the two. I had thought that to matter, I had to be seen mattering. Sitting on those pallets with the cold coming up through the wood, I understood for the first time that the work had been whole all along, with or without a single person knowing whose hands had shaped it, and that some part of me had been whole along with it, and I had simply never let myself stand close enough to feel it. Aisling found me out there. She had heard, of course. Everyone had heard. She climbed up onto the pallets beside me with the easy disregard for rank and propriety that flight surgeons seem to be issued along with their wings, and she sat with her shoulder against mine, and she looked at the sunrise. "They know your name now," she said. "For tonight," I said. "Brenna." "They know it for tonight," I said again. "Tomorrow there's another operation, and it has to disappear into the people running it. Same as always. That's the job. That's the whole job. The work was always the point. I knew that. I built my whole self around knowing that." I turned the empty cup in my hands. I just forgot, somewhere along the way, that knowing the work was the point didn't mean I had to pretend I wasn't standing next to it. I was allowed to stand next to it. I spent 14 years acting like even that was too much to ask for. She was quiet for a while. The sun cleared the ridge. The light came across the flight line and turned all the gray to gold for about 90 seconds, the way it does, before the day burned the color off. "So stand next to it," she said. I did not answer her, but something had loosened in me sitting on those pallets that had been closed since a hallway in 2014, not opened all the way, loosened, enough to let a little of the cold out and a little of the morning in. When I got up off the pallets, I did one small thing, and it was the only ceremony of the whole affair. I unzipped the gray civilian jacket, and I took it off, and I stood there for a second in the cold in my uniform with the oak leaf of a major on my chest, plain and visible, where anyone could read it. And then I folded the jacket over my arm, and I walked back into the TOC, and I walked in the front way, through the main entrance, past the spot where a lieutenant had decided there was nothing there to see, and I did not feel that I had to. I just wanted to. There is a difference, and I had earned the difference. The deployment did not end that morning. It went on for another 4 months the way deployments do, one operation bleeding into the next. The work never finished. But something was different in how I carried it. The after-action report named my authorship correctly. That sounds like a small thing, and it is not. Somewhere in the official record of that operation, in a document that will outlive everyone who was in the room, the plan is attributed to the person who built it. It is the first time in my career I made sure of that, not by demanding it, but simply by being in the room when the record was written, by standing next to the work the way Eisling had told me to. Holloway signed it. He read it first, and he looked up at me over the page, and he said, "This is right." And I said, "Yes, sir, it is." And that was the entire conversation, and it was enough. I started doing something else, too, in those 4 months that I had never done before. There was a young officer in the plan shop, a brand new planner, a lieutenant herself, sharp and terrified and trying to disappear behind her own competence, the exact way I had taught myself to. I watched her build a good piece of an operation, and then I watched her hand it up without her name on it, ready to let it dissolve into the shop, and I recognized it so completely that it ached. I stopped her. I made her put her name on it. She looked at me like I had asked her to do something dangerous, and in a way I had. "Ma'am," she said, "it's just staff work. It's the shop's." "Put your name on it," I told her. "When it works, you stand in the room. You don't fly forward 11 hours to watch it from the doorway, and you don't let anyone walk you out, and you don't let it go up the stairs on somebody else's chest. You sign your work and you stand next to it. That's not arrogance. That's just the truth, written down where people can find it." I held her gaze. "And that's an order, Lieutenant?" She put her name on it. I watched her do it, and I watched the small, frightened pride on her face, and I understood that I had just become, for one person, the thing I had needed at 31 and never had. That did more for the cold place in my chest than the whole night in the TOC had done. I learned that she had come into the army from a town in the desert that no one had ever heard of, and that she had taught herself most of what she knew from manuals read by flashlight after her shifts, and that she was, without question, the best raw planner I had seen in years, and that she was on a path to disappear exactly the way I had disappeared, into her own excellence, behind a wall of staff work with no name on it. I made it my business, for the rest of that deployment, to keep her from it. I put her in front of the commander. I made her brief her own work. I stood at the back of the room while she did it, terrified and competent, and I watched the commander nod, and I watched her realize that she was allowed to exist in the same room as the thing she had built. It was the single most useful thing I did on that entire deployment, and it was not in any after-action report, and that, finally, was the lesson all the way through. The record had been corrected for me once on a screen, but the thing that actually closed the cold place was not being seen. It was making sure someone else would be. The recognition I got that night corrected the record. Becoming the recognition for someone else was the part that actually healed. I did not leave the army. People sometimes expect that to be the end of a story like this, the dramatic exit, the walking away, the burning of the uniform. It was not my ending. The Army was not Wade Beckett, just as Lieutenant Brunner was not Wade Beckett. The Army was a vast and flawed and human institution that had erased me for years and had also, on one cold night, through a command sergeant major who read the work and a colonel who wanted the author and a captain who came back covered in dust to shake my hand, seen me exactly right. It was both of those things at once. Most things that are large enough to matter are both of those things at once. What changed was not whether I served. It was the terms. I stopped asking the institution to tell me I was real. I stopped taking the deal where I made myself small in exchange for a warmth that felt almost like belonging. When the credit games came around, and they always came around, I did not play them, and I did not let them play me. I signed my work, I stood next to it, I taught the people under me to do the same. And the people who had measured me by the work all along, Bonner and Ing and Frost and the Salises of the world who had needed page 11 and found it, those people stayed close, and they were enough. They were always going to be enough. I had just spent too long looking for belonging in the rooms that withheld it instead of in the people who had already given it. I am 43 now. I am still in. Last month I walked into a tactical operations center, a different one, a different war. The way there is always a different one. And a young battle captain at the door, a kid not much older than Bruner had been, saw me come through the curtain, and he came to attention before I had said a single word. He saw the rank on my collar, and he made his decision the safe way, the respectful way, the way you make it when you have not yet learned that the rank is the least interesting thing about anyone who walks through that door. I almost wanted to stop him. I almost wanted to tell him that the rank was not the point, that he should learn to read the room by the work and not the collar, the way Travis Bonner could. Because the day will come when someone walks through that curtain in a gray jacket with nothing on it to see, and the whole measure of him will be what he does in that moment, when there is nothing there to tell him who matters. I did not tell him that. There was an operation on the floor and the work came first. It always comes first. But I made a note to find him later, the way Holloway had made a note that night, and to ask him a question. How many people have you decided don't belong in a room this week just by looking at them? And were you right about all of them, or only about the ones who never came back to find out? So here's what I want to say to you, the one of you out there who needs it, because I know you are out there because I was you for a very long time. If they ever walk you out of a room you built, do not argue. I mean that. Do not waste the breath. The work knows your name even when the room does not. The thing you made is sitting right there, perfect and silent, with your fingerprints all over it, whether or not a single person in that room has thought to look. You do not have to flash anything. You do not have to burn anyone down to be made whole, and you do not ever have to make yourself small so that the people who got you wrong can stay comfortable. That deal is not belonging. It is rent, and you are allowed to stop paying it. Stand where you can see the door. Do your work so well that it cannot be denied. And then, this is the part I learned too late, stand next to it. Sign it. Let it be known that you were there, not loudly, not to win, just truthfully, the way you tell someone a fact they are about to need. And then wait. The truth has a way of coming back through the door it was carried out of. It came back through mine on a cold night at Bagram, on the screen of a man who had walked me to the gate, and all I had to do, in the end, was be standing tall enough to meet it. Be standing tall enough to meet it. That is the whole thing. That is everything I have.